you have it. Thanks, Thea, for being game to play with us. Now let's get on to the main event. So without further ado, I'm happy to welcome you all to Harnessing the Power of Lived Experience via Co-Design, presented by Thea Hogarth.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jack. And hello again to everyone. I really appreciate you all being here. I know it's been a long day. I know it's been a lot to take in. These kinds of things can really feel like drinking from a fire hose. So just moment of gratitude for everyone that's here. I'm so excited to be here today to talk to you about a topic that's become really important to me over the last couple of years. And it's this idea of how we can actually harness the power of lived experience using co-design methods as a way to engage more deeply with our audiences. But before we get into kind of the main event, let's start with this soul chestnut from our dear friend Steve Jobs, featuring an apocryphal quote from Henry Ford. I'll read it out. Some people say, give the customers what they want, but that's not my approach. Our job is to figure out what they're going to want before they do. I think Henry Ford once said, if I'd asked customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. People don't know what they want until you show it to them. That's why I never rely on market research. Our task is to read things that are not yet on the page. So, glossing over the general disregard for doing research on users and markets, the nugget that I want you to kind of hold on to from this is this idea that people don't know what they want until you show it to them. And the ways in which this idea has maybe morphed and evolved and reemerged in other places in our industry. This TED Talk, maybe a particularly spicy example with this kind of hot take headline, don't listen to your customers, do this instead. And this idea has kind of transformed almost into a narrative around research that people can't articulate what they want or what they need, and that it's our job as researchers to somehow decode that. And ideas like this can coalesce and merge into feedback or comments that you might even hear within your own product organization, like this. I think it's helpful to ask users about their problems, but there's no point to solutioning with them. Product and design can figure that out on their own. And this is just a composite paraphrase of some feedback that I've heard at various points in my life, in my career. And now I'll pause and just ask, does this sound familiar? Have you maybe heard any of these ideas before? And if so, if any of this is resonating with you or sounding familiar, I'd ask, why do you think you might have heard or even referenced that belief yourself? And I'll give you some time to reflect. Feel free to throw your thoughts in the chat or just keep them in your mind. And while you're reflecting on that, hello. As I said before, my name is Thea, and I'm a user researcher. I've just shared a few examples of a mindset that can turn into a bias within our product orgs. Regardless of their original intent, the original intent of these quotes, stories, and countless other case studies that demonstrate the same concept, the idea that solutions are the realm of designers, researchers, and product leaders can sometimes actually hold back our research practice. It can actually sometimes make it hard for us to learn from our users, and frankly, it can reduce the efficiency of our practice. So today, we're going to talk about the wisdom of lived experience and how building a co-design practice can bring us closer to our users and community, create a tight and efficient working group, and also guide us to sometimes unexpected and genuinely useful solutions. First, maybe a couple more random facts about me, just so you can understand exactly why I'm here talking about this today. I am the Associate Director of User Research at Brainpop, which is an edtech company that is known for making short videos that break down complex concepts for kids with accompanying quizzes, assessments, and games for kids to practice and demonstrate their knowledge and skills. My journey into edtech, an important step on it was when I went to graduate school and began studying literacy and communication and education. It's just been a passion for me ever since. And I've had many other past lives in these sorts of spaces, in edtech startups, teaching myself, and in the international educational development space. So in short, I've worked in a number of settings where well-intentioned paternalism has definitely caused some problems. We'll put it that way. And that's why this topic is so important to me. So, for the rest of our time together, I'm going to talk through a couple of alternatives and maybe kind of counter narratives to this assumption or bias that we can sometimes have against our wider audiences. I'll share some stories from my own experiences building a co-design practice. And finally, if you're on board with this idea of incorporating co-design into what you do, I'll share some questions and thought starters that hopefully can help you take your first steps. So first, let's get back into this idea of the way this pileup of stories can sometimes turn into mythologies, beliefs, and at worst, bias. It can make us sometimes think or hear echoed in the various spaces that we're working this idea that maybe regular folks out in the real world can't necessarily imagine innovative solutions to their problems. That dovetails with the assumption that the best way to solve a problem is to innovate. And finally, that because of this, we need specialized professionals to do all of this work from end to end. It's important to take a step back and clarify that these kinds of beliefs can exist without us knowing it and can sometimes come from innocuous and even helpful seeming assumptions. An example from my own work is that teachers are busy and stressed, and we should help them out and not ask them for too much. How much could they even contribute given all the other stressful factors in their lives right now? But when we preemptively minimize the potential contributions of our audience, we miss out on an opportunity to work alongside people who have a deep personal understanding of the situation or system we're trying to enter as designers and researchers. Arguably, it could be a waste of time trying to construct an understanding that will inherently be somewhat cursory. So, how do we counter the effects of the myth that people in the real world can't participate meaningfully in design process? Here are some examples from my own experience that now live in my head rent free as sort of antidotes to this. First, this idea of communities in emergencies, certainly a time where we might assume we should not ask too much, people are overtaxed. Many years ago, when I was still working in the international development space, I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Martina Fuchs about her global health initiatives with the Real Medicine Foundation. This organization builds hospitals and communities facing acute challenges after natural disasters. And this moment from our conversation has really stuck with me as an antidote to this argument that I've been talking about. When I asked her to break down her process for building sustainable health programs that have basically outlived their initial purpose to support communities in emergencies, this is what she said. It's so simple. Ask the people and listen to their answers. When I give talks, I often explain it this way. I'm a doctor, I'm pretty educated, and I know what I need. I live in Los Angeles, and we could have an earthquake or a tsunami anytime. And as an LA native, I can say that feels truer than ever. If I'm in a disaster, that doesn't mean I have changed who I am and what I need as a person. And I believe that this is the case for everybody. So that's our approach, asking the community, giving them the respect and dignity you would give to friends. In a disaster, there is chaos and there is fear, but listening to the people and to the community works every time. So what I learned from this is that even in the most acutely challenging situations, there are folks that can and want to contribute their knowledge and skills to the solution. A different kind of example from the day-to-day work that I do right now, also with an audience that we might not typically think about including in our design process, is kids in school. Sometimes there are really simple solutions that we miss because we are living in a certain status quo. And this is an amazing example of a problem that this fifth grader articulated so nicely. This student told us that they had an awful experience using Brainpop. And the reason why is that on the quiz, I misclicked and got a 9 out of 10 because there was no back button. just because it's not that deep doesn't mean that we would have noticed this. And you better believe that when given the opportunity to draw something, one thing that would have made their experience with Brainpop a little bit better, this kid gave us a back button. At some point, there was an instructional choice not to include a back button on the quiz, and that's why we were completely blind to this problem and the very clear solution. And this amazing fifth grader not only names the problem, but also designed the solution for us. These are concrete examples of how people with lived experience of a problem can envision the solutions they need without a heavy process of data collection and abstraction. People problem solve every day in context with deep knowledge of the system or organization that they're working within. When we co-design, we lend our skills and resources to build those solutions. We enter into communities with our own affordances to offer. So let's talk more about co-design. What do we actually mean by co-design, and what does this look like in practice? First, a couple of definitions. So far, you've definitely had some context clues. You may have some experience of your own doing co-design or with co-design practice. But of course, there is a much longer history to this and many other people out there in the world doing this kind of work. So here are two ways of thinking about it that I find helpful. The first is this, that co-design is a design-led process that uses creative and participatory methods. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. Instead, there are patterns and principles that can be applied in different ways with different people. Importantly, co-designers make decisions, not just suggestions. So there's like a shift in power, right? There's a shift in control in a way. And building on this, I love the way the folks over at Creative Reaction Lab have expanded on this work and extended the definition in this way. This design process focuses on a community's culture and needs so that they can gain tools to dismantle systemic oppression and create a future with equity for all. So these two things anchor me in the way I think about co-design because they're really concrete, right? There's a shift of power and the idea that the thing people walk away with from this process is a tool that they can use and bring into their lives immediately. So as I've mentioned, where I work at Brainpop, we've taken several steps to figure out what works for us and how to fit into our community, which I define as educators and kids, largely in the K-8 grade range. So let's talk a little bit about how that's been working for us. First, and most importantly, and I will say this again and again, the hardest part is getting started. So there are many different places I probably could have started with, what was our first attempt, but I'll start with the first attempt of a fully fleshed out co-design process that we were calling co-design. And in this first attempt, we wanted to overhaul the video watching experience on Brainpop, which obviously is pretty fundamental. It's one of the things that I first mentioned about the company. And although we already had some ideas of what we wanted to do, there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen. Folks from product, design, learning design, and other areas had opinions about what to do. So to bring everyone together, we planned a one-day workshop with a guest list of Brainpop employees and more or less equal numbers of teachers. We split people into working groups with a parity of Brainpops and teachers to work through a few design prompts together. At the end of the day, working through this co-creation process helped smooth out a lot of the internal conflict. It generated an amazing list of requirements, and then folks went off and built what would become a very popular new feature. It's called Pause Points. You can Google it. I'm not going to go that deep into it. This felt like a big win for co-design. But there was still a lot of room for that old chestnut of bias to creep in, especially at the end, where we noticed a strong preference in the group for analysis and abstraction, focusing on themes rather than zeroing in on some of the proposed solutions, which did have components and elements that are very similar to what ended up coming out in the final designs. But that all being said, the feature was good, and this first real dive into co-design gave us the institutional will we needed to do more co-design and go in a little bit deeper next time. Again, adhering to these principles of how can we make our audience members, decision makers, equal decision makers in this process, and how can we help them walk away with something that they can use right away. So in our next attempt, we wanted to make sure to continue to center teachers as decision makers and contributors, and also to hold ourselves accountable by showing our work. And I do want to give a quick shout out to my teammate, Mia. I believe she's here. She really took the reins on this project. And this time, our task was to build more flexibility into a key experience of the Brainpop science product. And instead of just a single session, this time we committed to a 3-session process where we would actually really be able to have kind of a continuous feedback loop with the teachers that were in our working group. It really means to teachers. Spoiler alert, it actually has way more to do with the students than the teachers. With all of this learning from our first session, we were able to spend a little bit of time figuring out some kind of potential design directions. And the next time we met, actually engage in our typical design crit process, but with teachers and audience members included in that conversation. So we did design crit, we did feature prioritization together. Teachers had active input. And again, we're actively participating in the decision making. And then finally, in our third session, we solidified the sort of group consensus on the design direction. And soon a lot of those changes will be implemented, and those teachers will be walking away with something that they've already figured out how they want to use in their classrooms and in their day-to-day lives. So what was so exciting about this was that it was a more inclusive process, and it was very efficient. We learned a lot, and we got really tight with this working group of teachers. So again, kudos to Mia for leading the charge on this second attempt and inspiring the work of our third attempt that is just building and extending this model. And our third attempt is still ongoing. We just kicked off last month. And this time we're tackling the big, hairy problem of creating data reports for teachers. This is a very spicy topic in the world of education right now. And how do we do this in a way that is both meaningful and fair to both teachers and students? So this time around, we're again going with an initial commitment of 3 to 4 sessions, but also hoping that we can kind of just have some continuous communication long term. And what's come of it so far is that we've once again incorporated a level setting activity around key terms and shared goals. This is how we all kind of coalesced around this concept of fairness being central to what we're doing. We've had some time for folks to share their personal stories and personal experiences with working with data and the impacts of data in the classroom, so that we have concrete scenarios that we can all relate to and refer back to. And finally, we've already done a little bit of brainstorming and kind of designing around associations between these objectives, the data points that we have access to, and these lived experiences that we're calling into the room through this storytelling. Starting from the beginning with such a big task, it's already clear that we need multiple disciplines, points of views, and modalities to tackle it. But to do that, we need to trust the experience of everyone in the room, because everyone's bringing a different affordance, a different set of skills and experiences to the space. So the process of checking bias, I would say, is ongoing. And frankly, the task is so humbling that it's very and daunting to do alone, that it's pretty easy to do this when you see what everybody else can bring into the space. So I'm really excited about this. I'm thrilled that we have a continuous commitment from an amazing working group, and that it really feels like we have the brain power and just the variety of experience in the room to tackle a really big systemic issue. So this is the takeaway. This is the moral of this section. With each additional attempt, our momentum has built and increased. We're able to do more. We get tighter alignment between our product team and our users, and we build a relationship with a working group that we can rely on for the long haul. So if you're in a situation where you have limited resources, there might be a bit of overhead to getting started, but the community you build will become a resource that you can rely on, and vice versa. So if you're bought in, if you think this sounds cool, if you're into the idea of doing co-design, here are just a couple of thoughts and kind of starters for how you might take your first steps. First of all, think about the what, right? Like, what are we doing? What are we looking into? What are you working on? Is there something that you're just starting, or a big challenge that affects your audience? It's really fun and generative to be able to start from a really fundamental place. But if you're already in the middle of something, it's also interesting to think about what kinds of research and design activities that you already have planned that you might be able to just tack a little kind of co-design flavor onto. A couple small things that you can do in that regard. Think about, if you're interviewing people, is there a way to incorporate a brainstorming activity in like a Jamboard or a Fig Jam, or something that's, accessible, and that kind of shifts the playing field, gives a little bit more control to the participant that you might be working with. If you're doing observations, maybe there's a way to include an opportunity for folks to reflect or sketch improvements. That's actually exactly how we ended up getting that feedback about the back button that I shared earlier from the 5th grader. Once you have a sense of the what and kind of what you're going to focus on, maybe what activity you might do, thinking about the who is really important. Who should be in this space? Who are the right people to be a part of this working group? And I can't emphasize enough how important this is. Invest the time in recruiting. You're trying to build something that is durable, that will last for a long time. So, or maybe not a long time, but a good time. First and foremost, think about balance. And when I say balance, the first thing that I meant when I said balance was thinking about how many people from your own organization you want to have in the room, and how many people from your wider audience and wider community you want to have in the room. What's going to feel like the most equitable split? Maybe it's parity. Maybe it's having absolutely equal numbers of both, or maybe it's choosing to outnumber yourselves, because so often we put our users and our participants in a position where they are the ones that are outnumbered. Another thing that this means as well is knowing that we're going to be bringing in people from a variety of different kind of disciplines and places. There may still be a little bit of a power dynamic in the room. So thinking too about a balance of speaking to the group time and personal, individual reflecting and writing and coming up with, I want to say, time. And just knowing that going in, knowing who's going to be in the space. When you're actually in the process of screening, I think a big piece of this is screening for knowledge and interest in the topic that you're going to be digging into. You want folks that are invested, that are willing to and excited to commit to something long-term. And then finally, of course, leaning into meaningful differences. This is about getting a broad range of perspectives into a room. So things in my world that I look for very importantly is like geographic diversity, making sure that we're not just looking at schools and the big urban centers where many of us live, many of us who work at this company live, but also folks in other parts of the country and the world, places that have a different mix of languages, or classrooms that have a different mix of student needs, and of course, a span of grade levels, because the development of the young brain is just a crazy thing to witness. And once you have a sense of who's going to be there, that's when you can start to kind of do this fun dance of like, how do I shift the power? How do I give the decision making as much as possible to the group as a whole? Pacing and scheduling is actually a really super easy way to do this and to make people feel like they're in control of what's happening to them. After the initial meeting, just let scheduling be collaborative. Let people fill out a doodle, make sure it fits into people's schedules and, is happening at a cadence that is sustainable for everybody that's opted into this. And when you think about the actual activities that you're going to be doing during your time, um, overplan and share goals at the beginning so everyone has a sense of where you're headed. But ultimately, be also willing to kind of throw a lot of that stuff out the window if needed. That's a teacher trick. Follow the group's lead on the topics and actions that are most meaningful, that seem to be generating the most conversation, or that people just don't want to stop doing. It's okay to follow that lead. And with that in mind, this gets us to the how, right? Like we know who's going to be there. We know the general sense of what's happening, but like, what does a workshop look like? What are the components of it? This circular format has been working super well for me. Obviously, we start out with a little bit of level setting. What does this topic mean to you? Build in a little bit of time or some activity to share personal stories. What does it look and feel like to be experiencing this phenomenon or engaging with this idea? And then finally, connect the dots between those things by making something, anything. Um, in your first meeting, it can be super low stakes, low fidelity, sticky notes on a whiteboard kind of thing. But just creating space to already start thinking about like, what do I need? And then finally, at the end, if there's time, circle back to that initial question, because things can come up. A lot of new things will come up as you work through some of these other steps. And if you have some designs at the end, you can ask this question of, what are these already saying about what we anticipate and the kind of future that we expect? A couple of activities that I really love to slot into some of these places are kind of the magic dust prompt of, you can do literally anything to make this better or to completely ruin it, with time for discussion. Empathy mapping is a modality that is shared rather than done internally. It's just a great way to give everyone a moment to really break down, okay, how do I think and feel? What are some of the core sensory details that I want to share in telling the story of my experience with whatever it is that we're looking at? And then finally, I already mentioned this, but design critique, it's a thing that you already do. It's a practice that is learnable and is an easy way to bring folks from your audience into the conversations that you're already having. So I know I'm a little bit over time. I really appreciate you all sticking with me. And in closing, I will just say once again, remember, if you're interested in doing this, start with anything. The hardest part is getting started. So I really hope that you're ready and excited to take your first small steps into co-design. And that is it. Thank you so much, Jack. I'm happy to take a couple questions if there's time.
Yeah.